All right, good evening, everyone. I hate to have to be the person that that breaks up great conversations. Usually they say, when you're the president of a place, you don't like to have to be the one that does the hard stuff. But I do have to break up the conversations that are going on right now. But it is to enable another wonderful conversation. And so my name's Seth Bodner, for those of you that I don't know, and it is my privilege to serve as the president of the University of Montana. And on behalf of the university, I want to welcome everyone here tonight. You're in for a treat. You're in for a great discussion. And it's a discussion that is really brought to us by the great work of the Mansfield Center. And we are so grateful for the tremendous work of the Mansfield Center, building upon the legacy of Maureen and Mike Mansfield, and building globally minded leaders of integrity. And to kick off tonight's event, I want to ask the fantastic director of the Mansfield Center, Dina Mansour, to come to stage.
Well, good evening and welcome to everyone. Welcome to our in-person audience as well as our Zoom audience. It is such an honor for me to welcome you all here to an event that is so in keeping with our mandate to host bipartisan events that bring people together for civil discourse. Certainly, it's an honor to have our governor here tonight, our top elected official in the state. The Mansfield Center was founded by an act of Congress in 1983 to support a dual mission in the legacy of Mike Mansfield of ethics in public affairs and democracy, as well as international engagement. And it's been our honor to do that at our home here at the University of Montana, where Mike Mansfield came from a background of poverty. He was a juvenile delinquent. He lied about his age when he was 14 to join the military, and he found his home here at the University of Montana. And so it's an honor to work for President Bodner, who is committed to graduating citizens that are engaged in our democracy. And we have a real commitment to youth. And so I'd like to welcome one of our terrific students of the University of Montana to the stage, Sophia Wilder, to introduce this evening's speakers.
Thank you, Dina, for that wonderful introduction. Before I begin, I would like to invite the governor and the moderator to the stage, please.
Thank you.
So good evening. My name is Sophia Wilder. Originally from San Diego, I'm a second-year student at the University of Montana, studying business and environmental science. In my short time at UM, I've already built a foundation in leadership through teaching and study abroad opportunities. And tonight, it is my honor to introduce Governor Greg Gianforte and our moderator, Mansfield Advisory Board Chair and Alps Corporation CEO, David Bell. Governor Gianforte is an accomplished businessman, politician, software engineer, and writer who serves our state as our 25th governor. Between 2017 and 2021, Governor Gianforte served as Montana's at-large congressman in the U.S. House of Representatives, where he focused on healthcare, natural resources, public lands, government reform, consumer protection, and telecommunication issues. David Bell is the president and CEO of Alps Corporation. Mr. Bell has co-founded and serves on the board of Grateful Nation Montana, an organization that provides tutoring, mentoring, and a college education for the children of Montana soldiers killed while on active duty in Iraq and Afghanistan. Thank you, Governor Gianforte and Mr. Bell, for speaking tonight. And thank you to the audience in person and on Zoom for joining us this evening. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you. What a great introduction. I think we have a public speaker in our midst too. I just want to welcome everyone. This is one of the most ideologically diverse rooms that I've been in Missoula, and I just want to say my appreciation to each of you for braving the weather and coming out this evening. I ran into my 17-year-old son on the way in the room this morning. I said, "Hey, buddy," and he looked around and said, "There are so many ways this could go wrong." And that's true, and that's why this discussion in this environment is so important. And so, Governor, I'd just like to thank you. You know, politicians like safe and predictable, and this discussion topic and this place is neither of those. And so thank you for accepting the invitation. I have something to request from each of you and the many hundreds of you who are watching virtually at this moment. There's something that we all have in common. As we're listening tonight, our brains will filter for words or points that reinforce our existing beliefs. Republicans and conservatives one way, Democrats and liberals another. Confirmation bias knows no ideological boundaries. I'm going to try to push back against mine and ask pointed questions. And I'd like to ask if you're willing to do the same and push back against yours. Even if our perspectives don't change, perhaps they will broaden just a little. And if we all end up a tad closer at the end of this hour, compared to when it began, it'll be a wonderful tribute to the life and legacy of Mike Mansfield. So with that, we ready to get going?
I'm all set.
Excellent. Let's start off. Bipartisanship starts with relationship, and relationships don't just magically materialize. They're built through a mutual investment of time, which can and often does result in trust and respect. It doesn't mean that ideological or policy differences magically harmonize. That's not realistic. It just means that mutual respect can be built. Breaking bread is as old as time itself. It's ancient and biblical, while simultaneously modern and cosmopolitan. Governor, I've known you since before you got into politics, and I know that you hosted meals at your home when you were in the private sector as part of your recruitment process. I know that you and Susan hosted meals at your home in DC with Democratic members of Congress, and I understand that that practice has continued with your role here as governor. There is a pattern, so there must be a philosophy. Let's talk for a moment about your views on breaking bread with others.
Okay, David, well, first, thank you for hosting this session for your work at the Mansfield Center. I want to start off by saying being the 25th governor of the state of Montana is the greatest honor of my life, and I take that responsibility very seriously. But you're right. I think that when we separate ourselves with technology or space or time, it's harder to understand other people, and it's much easier when there is a relationship. And I don't know any better way to do that than over a meal. My wife and I in Bozeman, if we're there for the week, we have folks for dinner at least 4 nights. I've made a promise coming into this office that we would turn the governor's home, which is our home in Helena, into a house of hospitality. We entertain every single night that we're there. And I think that as Montanans, we share so much more in common than separates us, but without a relationship, it's hard to find it. So philosophy, I'm Italian, you make food and you eat together and you understand each other better. I think that's one of the things that is pulling Washington, D.C. apart. It used to be that members of Congress lived there and raised their families there. That doesn't happen anymore. They come home. And I think my job is to build bridges, and I don't know a better way to do that than over a meal.
Excellent. So just from a formatting perspective, everybody who registered was given an opportunity to ask a question online. Those questions I've integrated into this evening, and everybody who is here in person had an opportunity to write down a question. Those questions will come to me in the latter part of this section. And so building off of that, and to your point about breaking bread and forming relationships, you brought that philosophy to being governor. And so let's talk about outreach that you've initiated with other members of the Party of Montana. And let me just kind of bring this around. This was, of all the different topics that so many of you submitted as questions, if they were clustered in topics or themes, this would be, I'm just going to give you a real quick handful. John from Helena, when specifically has the governor reached across the aisle to seek compromise, and what was the result? Joe from Lewistown, how does the governor go about facilitating civil discourse, something that has sadly been lost in America? Frank from Missoula, as governor, what are your thoughts about politically depolarizing our state? Sarah, also from Missoula, in what ways have you worked across the aisle to ensure bipartisanship? So these are all thematically consistent. And so I just ask you, Governor, for some examples.
Sure. So after I was elected in 2020, one of the first things I did was I called every single legislator. I think there were a few people that were shocked to hear from me, and that I was sincere. I wanted to know their views and what was important. So that was step one, just to say, hey, we're going to work together. I think good ideas come from Republicans, they come from Democrats, they come from independents. My wife and I, next month will have been married 34 years. And from that experience, I can tell you, no two people agree on everything. And that's okay. Ellie Boldman is here. We have a lot in common as it relates. I hope I don't screw up your reelection in saying this, but I will say that I'm very concerned about the welfare of kids in foster care and the services we deliver. We don't agree on a whole lot of stuff, but we do on that, and we find we can work together. I've hosted dinners in our home, and literally every night that Susan and I are in Helena, we have people for dinner, and it's a great way to share that. I made a commitment in the last legislative session, because this is a team sport. Legislating is a complicated, chaotic, messy business. It's the way our founding fathers structured the bicameral system that we have with the executive branch and the legislative branch. But I made a commitment to meet with the majority leadership and the minority leadership every single week during the session. Open, there's no agenda. Bring your items. Let's just talk about it. And there are times you can find stuff to work on. And I want to tell one quick story, if I could, from my time in Washington, because I spent the bulk. I'm an engineer, right? So I'm very analytical. I spent the bulk of my time in business negotiating contracts for software, and I served on one of the most hyper partisan committees in Washington. It was the Natural Resources Committee. And to put this is the group that handles all the federal lands issues. It handles a lot of the energy issues, permitting on federal lands. And to put it in basketball terminology, it was shirts and skins all the time. And there was one side of the aisle where the only thing that got discussed was climate change. And on the other side, it was like frack, baby frack. And every committee meeting was like this. They go at each other. And for my part, I just would not participate in that because I didn't think it was constructive. And there was a gentleman, we were in my first session in Congress, the Republicans were in the majority. And during that time, a gentleman approached me who was on the committee, Jared Huffman, who was representative from California, probably one of the most liberal individuals on the Natural Resources Committee. And he's after the one committee hearing one day, he says, "Hey, Greg, we're coming to Montana." I said, "What are you doing in Montana?" He says, "Well, we're coming to see the wolves in Yellowstone Park." And it's me and Peter DeFazio from Oregon and Don Beyer from Virginia. And these are like the three farthest left people on the committee. I said, "Well, you got to be flying into Bozeman." He says, "Yeah, I think we are." I said, "Well, Montana hospitality, you have to come to my home. I want to serve you a meal." So it was February. And a funny thing, when you come to our home, almost everybody in the state has been to our home. But sometimes Google Maps delivers you to our driveway, and sometimes it delivers you to the pipe gate in our horse pasture. So they're late. I'm like, I made this meal and I don't know where they are. They're coming for lunch. And next thing I know, there's a 2-wheel drive sedan on the other side of the river in the pasture in 2 feet of snow. And in the winter, there's a sleigh that goes through. So they were following the sleigh tracks. And next thing you see, the car goes off the tracks. And I'm thinking, this is a disaster. So I put my boots on. I had to post hole out over the river, and I didn't know what to say. So I said, "Welcome to Montana." And they all had to post hole into the house. We had a nice meal. We didn't talk about politics. We're just enjoying each other's company. And at the end of the meal, the staffer who was with them said, "Congressman, I don't think I can get the car out of the field." I said, "I know you can't get it out." And I had to get my John Deere tractor and a tow strap, and I drug them back to the road, and we packed them up, and they went off and looked at the wolves. But here's the clincher. The Democrats won Congress in the 116th. And Jared Huffman became chairman of the Natural Resources Committee. And if you remember, St. Mary's up out of Glacier County supplies water to the whole High Line. And the spring rains washed out a couple of the drops, and there was going to be no water for Havre or Chinook or 140,000 acres. And this was the committee of jurisdiction. And Jared Huffman had no reason to let me get a funding bill through Natural Resources to pay for the repair of St. Mary's. But I went and asked for a favor, and I reminded them they'd still be stuck in the snow field if I hadn't dug him out. And he gave me the hearing, and we got the bill passed, and we got the funding to replace the St. Mary's thing. So it just shows you, now he wasn't in that position when I dug him out of the snowbank, but it was just the right thing to do. And for my part in all this, we can disagree on stuff, that's okay, but we don't have to call each other names.
Well said. Well said. Well, let's talk a little bit about what's going on here at home too. In the upcoming legislative session, there are clearly going to be legislative goals resulting in traditional party camps, Republicans on one side and Democrats on the other. That's a given, and there's nothing new about it. But with that said, and this is a question that comes from Jacob in Missoula, who's actually also part of the many people from the press that's here this evening. Can you think of legislative opportunities that give you the most hope for bipartisanship in the upcoming session?
Well, we had a lot of bipartisanship in the last session. People from the outside, you think everybody's fighting with each other all the time. It's not. I mean, the statistic, I looked this up. I mean, lots of bills don't make it through because it's a complicated process, and not everybody thinks everybody else's bill is the best thing since sliced bread. But of the bills that got signed into law, and I signed, honestly, almost everything that got to me. I only vetoed 17 bills, which was a much lower number than what had happened. And I ended up signing over 500 bills this last session. But 69% of the bills that passed and got my signature had 80 to 100% approval in the legislative branch. Now, it's not 80 to 100% of just Republicans. That's 80 to 100% of all the members. So there is very broad-based support. And I think about some of the bipartisan stuff we did last session. The MTech program that pays small employers to send their employees to get trades education. The work we did on the Heart Fund to provide $25 million a year for addiction recovery and mental health issues. We got rid of restrictions on telehealth. We made permanent some of the things we did during the pandemic. We, in a bipartisan way, we were 50th in the country in starting teacher pay. With bipartisan support, we raised starting teacher pay in Montana. We had broad bipartisan support for missing and murdered Indigenous persons. We got the ARPA stuff done, which in a bipartisan way, we created bipartisan committees to do the authorization. So I think we can build on the success we had. And again, I think good ideas come from Republicans, Democrats, and independents. They can come from anywhere.
Yeah, I got that. Thank you. And I mean, I recognize that we're early in the process, in the kind of the legislative ramp up. Legislators are just now thinking about and talking about what their legislative priorities will look like. So it's early to be asking this question, but as you've had some of these preliminary conversations, do you see any opportunities that you specifically think could lend itself to bipartisanship in the next session? You clearly listed off a healthy list of bipartisan efforts in the most recent session.
I believe in the 2023 session, we will again have very broad bipartisan support for many of the things we're doing. We're not going to agree on everybody. No two people do. But on 69% of the bills that we signed into law last time, we had 80 to 100% of the legislators voting for them.
Gotcha. And then let me ask a question on behalf of Jessica. This is about, really could speak to the process of the role that the governor's office plays in how legislation weaves its way through the process and ultimately survives. This is from Jessica in Geyser. And Jessica says, I would first like to thank you for your contribution and efforts in the generous donation of the Gianforte Foundation gave to the Montana Historical Society. Thank you for supporting Montana history and culture. My question is based on the topic of today's dialogue, the challenge and opportunities of bipartisanship. Because I served in the 67th session of the Montana legislature in 2021, representing House District 48 out of Billings, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on why almost every single bill the Democratic legislators sponsored was killed by the Republican majority. Did you and your staff do anything to facilitate passage of more Democratic bills? If so, what did you and your staff do? If not, why not? Thank you for being here today.
I served in Congress when Nancy Pelosi was in charge, so you don't have to tell me about getting bills killed. I experienced it myself. I will say I signed the vast majority of the bills that got to my desk. There were very few, and the ones that I could not sign were generally because there was some drafting error and there wasn't enough time to fix it. I think, how many people have read Jordan Peterson, 12 Rules for Life? He has a rule which I really like, which is go into every conversation expecting to learn something. And I approach life like that. And because if someone's passionate about something, even if there's a lot of stuff we don't agree on, there is some thread of truth and legitimacy in what they're saying. And if you work hard to listen to what they're saying, usually the outcome, always the outcome is better. The critic, if heard well, they don't necessarily have to prevail in entirety, but there's something in their concern that can be incorporated into the solution. And that's why I always just make sure my door is open. And I have to, just because of numbers, work through majority and minority leadership. So an individual legislator comes to me and says, I want your support on my bill. It's like, okay, well, it has to get through the House and the Senate first before my opinion even matters. But I'm happy to help them in a way that's useful to say, listen, if this bill got to my desk, you'd have to make these 2 changes to it before I could sign it. And that at least gives them some direction. I think approaches other administrations have taken has been, legislature, you do your business, and then I'll decide if I'm going to support it. I personally don't think that's very constructive.
Right. And what's your sense on the relationship between the leadership of both parties? Because to your point, your role is to sign or veto bills, but their role is to determine which of those bills emerges from committee and ultimately moves into that final stage before it becomes law. I mean, to her point, bills that don't survive die at that point before they get to your desk. I mean, what's your sense of the landscape in what is mathematically a quite red legislature in terms of the relationship between the party leadership?
Red or blue, most bills die. That's just the way it works. I mean, they just do, right? I mean, I'm looking at 2 legislators right here. Every legislator comes in with their little my precious. And sometimes other people think it's a my precious too, and sometimes they don't.
Gotcha. Okay, so let's think about some of the symptoms that can create some of the division that we are witnessing, most pronounced on the federal level, but certainly we're not immune to it in Montana. I'm going to suggest, Governor, four forces that work against bipartisanship. And I'd like to know if you agree or not, and what your thoughts are. Not that any of these factors are set out to work against bipartisanship, because I don't believe that the primary goal of any is to work against it. But here they are. 1, term limits, well-intended and quite effective at ensuring elected officials don't get too entrenched. The positive of term limits may be abundant, and for the sake of argument, let's just assume they are. But with a limited window for your term, there seems that we at least have to recognize it's harder to play the quote, the long game for politicians, and bipartisanship is often a long game. And I'm not asking for you to support or oppose term limits, just to comment on this element of it, but I'll run through all four and then ask for your thoughts on whichever are most interesting to you. So term limits is one. Media, number two. Media is a business, and that business is primarily underwritten by ad revenue. Ad revenue is driven by eyeballs on screens, and the human nature is attracted to divisive conflict. The media gives the public what it wants, at least in terms of what sells, even if it's simultaneously highly destructive to our republic. So the media, number two. Number three, social media. Echo chambers, algorithms serving up a black hole of confirmation bias. Need we say more? And then fourth, this is going to get me crossed off some invite lists here this week, political parties themselves. Whether the party is Republican or Democrat, it is easier to mobilize an army when there is a conflict. The goal of the party is to energize its members and grow itself. And with all the other good that the parties can do, and they do a lot of other good, often those goals can be in direct conflict with civility and respect towards others. Any thoughts on any or all of these, Governor?
Well, I'm not sure term limits contribute to partisanship. I generally am a fan. I think it shifts more power to the administrative state, but with proper leadership, that's not a problem. But I don't think it contributes. I think not to be overly critical, but I think our behavior as individuals has deteriorated. I see, and I would point to social media primarily, because people, for whatever reason, I mean, there's always two sides to every story. And I make a point, just when somebody comes running into my office and they say, did you hear what so-and-so did? Aren't you going to do something about it? My first response is, well, I want to hear the other side of the story. Because there's always another side of the story. And the truth always exists somewhere in the middle. And what I see on social media is just one side of the story with sometimes an articulate opinion expressed, and then a pejorative about the other person's personal character or hygiene. You know, and that's the part that really makes the whole conversation degenerate. So I think we ought to be able to express our opinions and have discussions based on the facts of the issue without insulting the other person. I always like the 3-rule test that we learned back in elementary school, right? Is it the truth? Does it need to be said? That's the one that you usually run afoul of. And is it kind? Right? And if we all applied that test a little more often, I know I try to, and make sure I understand the other side of the story, it gets less confrontational. So of those things, I think the guiltiest party is social media.
Well, it's interesting that you lock onto that one, because social media platforms have come under fire on the federal level by both parties for different reasons, but it seems to be one of the rare sources of true bipartisanship that exists in Washington. I mean, you were in Congress, and because of your background, I believe you found yourself on some pretty important committees related to technology and social media. Is there anything that you might share based on what you were involved in, or what you witnessed, or what you predict to be any type of legislative effort on the federal level to try to address the cancerous effect that social media has so clearly had on civil public discourse?
Very little in Washington happens until there's a crisis. And I'm not sure we've reached crisis level yet. I mean, as Mike Pence once said, I'm a conservative, but I'm not mad about it. You know, I'm happy to express my views based on the principles of the issues, and I want to hear other people express their opinions, and then we'll have a dialogue. Washington, there is so much more bipartisanship here in Montana than there ever was in Washington, because there's two types of legislators in Washington. One, I mean, any legislator who wants to get on national TV walks out of the House chamber into the hallway between there and the rotunda and can step in front of a TV camera and speak to all of America. And what the cameras want, to your point about the business, is they want controversy, they want vitriol, and there are members of Congress that are very willing to give that. I went there to do the right thing for Montana. I didn't find myself on national TV very often because there just wasn't appropriate. I went there to legislate. The other big difference between Washington and Montana, which I think is to our benefit here, is that we have a citizen legislature that when the 90-day session is over every 2 years, our legislators go back to become dentists and lawyers and farmers and ranchers. And when they come back 2 years later, they bring those real world experiences with them. I'm thankful that they all have day jobs. I was really happy to see them leave town. And I know they were happy to go, they told me. But they're going home to reality. And they bring reality back to Helena when they come back at the next session. That reality never seems to get to Washington, D.C. And you have these moths attracted to the light, creating this vitriol. And that noise makes it hard to get anything else done.
You know, you've brought up in several different contexts the kind of juxtaposition between the federal experience and being back here in Montana. And so I'd like to change gears and talk a little bit about what bipartisanship means. And let's think about this more in a general or academic sense and less about your role or efforts in bipartisanship. And I hadn't really thought about this much until I reflected in preparation for our conversation, but hear me out for a moment. Bipartisanship, as it's commonly thought of by voters, means working together and mutual concessions. But let's compare two different scenarios and see if it leads us to at least two different ways to look at what bipartisanship is. First scenario, to your point, at the federal level, an evenly divided Congress, where in order to move legislative policy forward at all, both sides need to concede some level of policy priorities, simply in order to get anything done. Voters don't like total gridlock, so they think of bipartisanship in the context of working together and making concessions that are necessary to just move the ball forward. Yes. Then let's think about that in a scenario like back at home, as opposed to when the governing body is evenly divided. For example, like in Montana, the math by party and therefore the political reality is different. Montana has a Republican governor and a strong majority Republican legislature. You ran your campaign with an unambiguously conservative platform and were elected by more votes in 20 than any governor in Montana history, with a 12.8 margin of victory, which is the greatest for any first-term governor since 1920. The people who elected you expect you to carry out what you pledged to do in the campaign. The reality of the political math, whether you like it or whether you don't like it, is different because it means policy concessions are not needed in order to move legislation. So here's my question, Governor. In this context, is bipartisanship less about policy concessions to get something done and more about civility and giving the minority respect and an opportunity to be heard?
I believe every individual is a representative of their constituents, and they reflect the views of their constituents. Someone elected, I understand that Missoula is a little more Democrat than other parts of the state.
There's a rumor about that.
So it's logical that a legislator from Missoula is going to have more liberal views. That's okay. It's the same in Washington. They represent their thing. But I go into with the assumption that there is a point to what they're trying to express. And if there's a way to incorporate it, often there is. I think when you have any discussion with any group of people, if you can hear the critic, even if you don't do exactly what they're asking, the outcome of the discussion is more robust than it would have been otherwise. The legislative process is really messy. John Boehner, former speaker, said one time that working with a legislature is like running down the street at full speed with a wheelbarrow filled with frogs. And you hope you have enough frogs in the wheelbarrow when you get to the end to actually get the thing passed, right? So, and I think it's a good image. And I think one of the biggest lessons I brought back from Washington, and I hope that I can be a better governor because of my experience in Washington. But in my first session in Congress, the Republicans were in charge of the House and the Senate. We had a Republican president. we had an opportunity to do real immigration reform. And we had a package that was 85% of what we wanted. And it incorporated many of the things that the other side wanted as well. If we could have gotten all the Republican votes, it would have passed. But there was a contingent of the Republican Party that 85% was not enough. They said, we're in charge. We want 100% of what we want. And we needed 114 votes to get it passed. We had, I think, 97 or 102. And the net result was we got no immigration reform. So one of the things I learned in business is if someone hands you half of what you want, you take it. And I think that is a lost art in Washington. I'd much rather, now, that being said, there are certain things that I campaigned on that are core principles that I will never compromise. But there's a lot of gray and there's a lot of nuance around coming up with a solution. As long as a core principle is not involved, I'm happy to take input from anybody. If it builds one more vote, you're that much closer to getting the thing done.
Thank you. Great questions coming from the audience. I just reviewed a stack that was handed to me. So I'm going to roll through a couple more that were asked on the virtual registration. Tom from Helena asks, thoughts on 83% of Montana's House districts being non-competitive, 12 House members unopposed, 6 Senate? Question mark. I didn't fact check.
Yeah, more people should run. That would solve that problem.
All right. Moving right along. Trevor from Great Falls asks, since you served in Congress and now as governor, can you speak to differences that you've noticed in bipartisanship and political involvement between Montana and federal? If you kind of addressed that.
I think we talked about that.
Right. So let's go to Sarah in Missoula. And this is an interesting perspective because Montana has been described in some ways as at least 2, in some cases 2 or 3 different states in terms of the economy and because of the economy, what the constituents in Montana want. Sarah from Missoula asks, do you see urban and rural differences shaping effective or ineffective bipartisanship in Montana?
I get to all 56 counties every year. I'm in the process of doing that again this year. And Sarah's right. There are many Montanans. I have to represent the whole state. And I can't do what every single person wants. So I try, again, I campaign on a core set of principles. There are certain things that are inviolable there. And there's other stuff we ought to have discussions around. I mean, I was just down in southeastern Montana 2 weeks ago, and boy, they're dry as a bone, and they're getting ready to sell their cattle herds off. We need rain desperately. And there are other places in the state, particularly on our reservations, where we don't have enough jobs and addiction is rampant and families are falling apart. But when there is an issue, what I try and do in a dialogue with somebody I agree with or don't agree with on a particular point is first to understand where they're coming from. What is it they're trying to accomplish? And then secondly, there's always a principle. And if you can go back to the principle, almost with anyone of any political persuasion, you can find common ground. I'll give you an example. Like in education, people have views around teacher pay, licensure, curriculum, all these things. And if you get down in the weeds talking about that, you got to get into the weeds to get that stuff figured out. But if you come back to a principle, and the principle I follow in education policy is that we ought to be helping every person reach their full potential. And often understanding a principle like that now gives you a lens to look at a policy proposal, and often you can find common ground. So I think understanding the core principle in a divisive issue that allows you to find common ground makes it easier to go forward.
Great. And we've talked about bipartisanship thus far this evening in the context of Democrats and Republicans, but within the Republican Party, there's, let's just call it a pretty wide variety of elected legislators. To what extent is managing the various colors within the Republican Party?
That's the job of legislative leadership.
Not going to take that bait?
No, Seriously, I mean, if they can't get it passed, I can't sign it. So I'm not trying to be too dismissive here, but we work closely with legislative leadership. I think better is always possible, but my couch is often filled with people of various persuasions within our own party trying to find common ground. And sometimes we do, and sometimes we don't. You don't need every vote to pass something. That doesn't mean people's beliefs should be ignored, but if you get a majority of the votes, the bill passes.
Okay, and this is coming from the audience that doesn't have a name on it, but what do you see as the greatest divide between Republicans and Democrats in the state? Are there central issues that you think really epitomize, what we do have in terms of division politically in our state?
I think we have more in common than separates us. I really do. And if we focus on building the relationship and going back to core principles, we'd have much more common ground. I don't approach my job as a partisan job. I really don't. That may sound overly simplistic, but I really believe it's true.
You think that there are, but for the issues that you establish as your kind of core principles, right? Those
I don't even think the core principles have to be divisive. I mean, I have a pretty simple mission statement for the people of Montana. We've been exporting our kids for decades. We want to create an environment where we have more good paying jobs. And in the process, we want to protect our way of life. Those are the things that I ran for, and those are the things I work for every day. And honestly, I think most Democrats and Republicans believe in those two things. Nobody wants to give up our way of life here. And people would like to, I'd like to see my kids. I want to see my grandkids more. But because my kids aren't here, I don't see my grandkids. And I think a lot of families are in that same situation. And that is a unifying thing, not a divisive thing.
And would you say that, what you talked about just now was really, kind of the heritage of Montana and the strength of our economy? And do you think that those two topics, and as bipartisan as they are, is a good reason why such a high percentage of the bills, probably surprisingly high, right? The stat I received from Legislative Services was that in the last session, slightly over 2/3 of all bills passed had a majority greater than the majority, right? And that's just kind of the best way to summarize it, because you have bills introduced by Democrats, bills introduced by Republicans, both bills co-sponsored by both. So the best way to kind of encapsulate it without rattling off a bunch of statistics is slightly over 2/3 of all bills that emerged had a majority greater than the majority. You don't read about that on the front page of the paper, and you don't see it on the news. It's not provocative enough, but it's a real important strength that I think it's important for all of us. It doesn't mean that there aren't challenges. There are, and there will be tomorrow, but it starts us off in a base of partnership. Yes?
I believe that's true.
And so let's go to the other side. What do you see as the most important issues to Montana right now? Are there dynamics that are geopolitical related? Are there dynamics on the fiscal or social or other fronts that you see as timely issues that you'd like to see addressed in this next session?
Well, there aren't going to be a lot of surprises from our administration. I mean, we laid out, when I campaigned, we laid out a business plan for the state. It's about more good paying jobs so our kids don't have to leave, and protect our way of life. And I think I played football in high school, and I think that most football games are won with 3 to 5 yard plays. I think we ran a bunch of plays this last session. We got to move the chains. We put some points on the board. We're going to run some more plays that are towards the same end zone. I think there's more we need to do to make our tax code more competitive and simpler. We just categorized all the regulations in the state of Montana. And in case you were curious, we have 16,000. There are 60,000 shall nots, must nots, and prohibiteds in our regulations. And this was the thing. We just automated all this, and we're doing this red tape relief because we need regulations to protect the environment and to protect public safety, but we're overcome with too many of them. So we put all the regulations into this computer system, and we had it analyze the pros, and it told us the level of education required to read a Montana regulation. Do you know what we learned? A high school diploma is not enough. A college degree is not enough to read Montana regulations. A master's degree is not enough. A PhD is not enough. You need to have a PhD and do postdoctoral work to understand Montana regulations. You need on average 20 years of formal education to be at the educational level to read the regs. I think there's room for improvement.
A little too complicated then?
Yeah, and that's why we're rewriting them. And we're going to write them in such a way that a small business owner on Main Street can read them and figure out what they need to do and what they cannot do. And I think that's something we can all agree on. Because if we can remove the friction and that small business owner can spend more time serving their customers and less time dealing with these regulations, honestly, there'll be better state jobs and the work of the state worker won't be so complicated. So there's a lot of benefits to that.
That's great. And along those lines, this is another question from the audience. We are celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Montana Constitution. What do you cherish about this foundational bipartisan document?
We are so blessed. I'm kind of a history guy. I love history. I read 4 to 5 books a month, all nonfiction. I just got done reading a book on territorial politics in Montana from 1864 to 1889. I think the fundamental rights that are encompassed there, the 3-part governmental system, the bicameral legislature, it's complicated and it's really hard to get stuff done. And I'm so thankful for that because we'd have more government otherwise. And I really think that you brought up earlier, this history project, and I want to just talk about that for a second because this is a really unique opportunity. There is a building in Virginia City called Stonewall Hall, and it's where the Montana Territorial Legislature met from 1865 to 1875, and it is in severe disrepair, and it is one stiff breeze away from being a pile of bricks. The owner of that building was in private hands up until 2 weeks ago, where the owner donated it to the state of Montana. And I've personally been involved, and Ellie's been helping, and other people. So far we've secured $560,000 private donations to renovate Stonewall Hall. The upstairs we have a picture of the 1870 Montana legislature meeting in this building. And let me just say, back then, there was way more facial hair. It's really a cool building. The downstairs is going to be renovated as a retail space, and it'll be leased out, so the income will pay for the ongoing operations. If you're interested, it's a 501c3 Montana History Foundation. We'd welcome your contributions to help us restore a piece of Montana history.
And another great example of where Montanans can come together. Well, I know we're nearing the rounding third base and nearing the end of our time here. Let me ask you a question about your wife, Susan. She's also an accomplished engineer, and she's helped run various operations in a number of your ventures. It's inspiring to see you succeed as a team, and both personally and professionally. Are you still able to use Susan as a sounding board for some of your gubernatorial decisions?
I'm so blessed. I mean, as I mentioned, we'll be married 34 years next month. She's an engineer, I'm an engineer, and we've done everything together. We raised our 4 kids together in Bozeman. We've started 5 businesses together. She was the controller in our first business, actually our 5th business in Bozeman. She was the controller till we were 60 people. She quit one day, and I had to hire 3 CPAs to replace her. And she's been with me on this journey too. She normally would be here tonight. We have family in Bozeman that she's entertaining. But yes, she helps me as a sounding board, as a supporter, and she helps me entertain every time that we're out, and we campaign together and we serve together.
Excellent, a true partnership. let me mention a quote. It may have been misattributed to Abe Lincoln, but it's reported that he said, and I quote, "Nearly all men can stand adversity, but if you want to test a man's character, give him power." Governor, what is the test of character for a party or an elected leader who is entrusted with power?
You know, that's a really relevant question, because I think our founding fathers envisioned that people in public service would have had a career of some sort. They could have been a farmer or a lawyer or a dentist or software engineer. Maybe they didn't think of that. But then they do public service as kind of a swan song in their career. I think there's real benefit in that, because it's what drove me to public service. It's a matter of wanting to make a difference for as many people as possible. I'm not doing this to, occupy an office. I'm doing this because I think Montana's not reaching its full potential, and I think we can do better. So I think ultimately the answer to your question is, the ultimate test of character is, did you do what you said you were going to do?
Thank you. Well, this question is from Randy. Thank you, Randy, for putting your name on it here in the audience. And this is a question really to try to take your temperature on what you sense is the real state of our democracy. And Randy's question is, what is your response to those who fear the, quote, demise of democracy and our democratic institutions? That doesn't sound like a Montana-specific question necessarily, but in general, you've been exposed to a lot. What's your perspective?
Yeah, Mark Twain said the rumors of my death are greatly exaggerated. And I think that's true. I mean, I think what we have here is in this country and in this state is incredibly precious and incredibly fragile. So it's our job to be vigilant to protect it for the next generation. And which founding father was it that said when they left Independence Hall and what was it, 1787, just after the Constitutional Convention, where we got rid of our Articles of Confederation and wrote the Constitution, and they shouted and said, "What kind of government do we have? It's a republic if you can keep it."
That's Franklin, I think.
And I think that's true. That's why the work of the Mansfield Center is so important in helping people understand the underpinnings of this great country, and because a piece of paper called a constitution is not going to protect our freedoms. It's the engagement of citizens and willing and talented people willing to put their lives on hold to serve for a period of time to protect this experiment in freedom that we have. And so I'm an optimist. I wouldn't do this job if I wasn't an optimist. I think better is possible, and we're a long ways away from demise.
Well, thank you. And let me just finish with one last question. And across all of Western society, and particularly here in the United States, the pace of change, and particularly the pace of changing societal norms, is of real concern to many Montanans, and not all in one direction. Some people see these kinds of changes as long overdue and want changes to happen even faster, and others worry that we are losing sight of things we hold precious as we abandon traditional norms for new ways. What can you say to Montanans on both sides of that divide? What should we expect the future to be like, and how can Montana's elected leadership, you, Governor, point the way to a future that we can all live with?
I think it's an important question. From my perspective, I recognize that I'm the governor of the entire state. My door is open. I like to hear from folks. That's why I travel around and visit with people. It's the reason why I'm here tonight, is to hear the questions of folks. And this is not about what Greg wants for Montana, right? I campaigned on a set of principles that gave me certain authority because I was elected on those principles. Those are the ones that I'm not going to compromise. But within that context, this vision of a prosperous Montana where people can achieve the American dream, our kids don't have to leave if they don't want to, while we're protecting these rights that were represented in the Constitution. That's why I'm in office. And I'm a light touch guy. We don't want a heavy hand from our government. Resistance occurs. I was reading some philosophy here recently. Resistance occurs when tyranny and oppression begin. And our country is founded on individual freedoms and liberties, and we need to protect those for every Montanan. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. It does, and it's a great way to roll forward and out of this evening. The spirit and the legacy of Senator Mansfield is one for civility and civil discourse, bipartisanship, working together. And this effort and the other efforts of the Mansfield Center is not to sway people's opinion in one direction or another, to change people's minds from whatever it is. It's to promote the opportunity for us to come together, to identify ways in which we do share a common bond. We do care about common priorities for our state and even for our nation. And that we can not just coexist together, but we can thrive because of our differences. But as the governor pointed out, what's necessary is respect, and what's necessary to eliminate is name calling and other things that break down relationships. So I hope that in the hour that you spent with us this evening, all of you here in the auditorium and the many hundreds of you who are watching online, I hope that you broadened your horizon a little bit. And Governor Gianforte, I just want to thank you again. This is an unusual invitation to accept, and in these times, that's why it's such an important invitation to accept. So I appreciate you unhesitating in your willingness to step forward and say, yes, I'd like to do this. So thank you very much.
It's an honor to be here. Thank you.
Right. Well, and Mr. Governor, thank you. And David, thank you for expertly facilitating a wonderful conversation. You know, I want to say thank you on behalf of the entire University of Montana. And I think Governor Gianforte, the lesson you shared of approaching every conversation with an intention and a goal to learn something. Tonight is a conversation in which we all had an opportunity to learn something. Tonight was a conversation in which we all had an opportunity to recommit ourselves to working across ideological divides and working toward the common good. Tonight is a night that, frankly, I think Maureen and Mike Mansfield would be proud to see happening here at the University of Montana. And I want to say thank you again. David and I want to present a gift to you on behalf of the university, on behalf of the Mansfield Center. You know, we all have drawn so many lessons from the life of Mike Mansfield, the service of Mike Mansfield. One lesson from Mike Mansfield that my wife would say I could learn is his brevity sometimes in answering questions. And we thought it might be a nice reminder. We have a Renaissance man of sorts that serves on the Mansfield Center board. Many of you know John Benyon, an author, an analyst, and a chef, and is also a carver, a wood carver. And he presented, or for you this evening, created for you this evening, a wood carving with a very Mansfield-esque quote when he was often responding to questions from reporters. Many may remember, and I know Kim Visser, who worked for Senator Mansfield and Ambassador Mansfield, would remember this fondly. You know, when asked a long and detailed question, would often finish with a yep or nope. And so tonight we're sharing with you a John Benyon created work of art with an outline of Senator Mansfield with the simple words, yep. So thank you, Governor Gianforte.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That's great. Here, let's get a picture.
As the board chair.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everybody.
everyone.